Super excited to welcome you today. We will be talking about trust and safety focused support, specifically trauma-informed support that supports resilience and well-being strategies for trust and safety teams and the unique work that they do. And I couldn't be more excited to be hosting this with Lisa. And we'll go ahead and give a quick introduction before we get started. My name is Kiki or Kristen, either one works. I'm a leadership coach. I'm also a consultant, and I've had the pleasure of working and collaborating with Conterra over the past almost 12 years, I think. My first experience was when I worked back at Airbnb, and they helped bring in some services for our trust and safety team at Airbnb. And I just couldn't be more excited to host this today with Lisa almost 12 years later, and talking about how to increase resilience and well-being in trust and safety organizations. Lisa, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Kiki. So my name is Lisa McKay. I'm Conterra Group's Senior Training Advisor. And I guess to sort of go a bit way back a long time ago now, when I first studied forensic psychology, that's when the seeds were planted of sort of expertise in this particular area that's borne fruit in ways I couldn't have foreseen at the time. But I qualified as a forensic psychologist in Australia a very long time ago. And a lot of my early work was in places like I worked in a maximum security men's prison. I worked with the state police and on one of their critical incident response teams. And I worked for the New South Wales state government on a child death and child sex offences review team. And that all taught me a lot firsthand about the impact of working with graphic content and about vicarious trauma. And I won't go through the whole career story, but 2 decades later, that has borne fruit in some interesting arenas. And one of them is working with trust and safety teams who are also exposed to a lot of graphic content. So Kiki and I are so excited to be able to talk to you today about this unusual area and the unusual pressures that these teams face.
Thank you, Lisa. So today we will be going through a case study review. We'll start off talking about just an overview and background information. Then we'll move into talking through challenges and needs of the organization. We'll touch on services and solutions to meet those needs. And we'll also talk a little bit around vicarious trauma and why it's an important concept to be aware of with some of the work that trust and safety teams handle. And then we'll talk a little bit about the data and results from the case study, as well as ongoing support and next steps. Great. Amazing. So let's just start off, Lisa, if you can give us a brief overview of the case study that we'll be talking about today, and any background information about the company and the scope of the organization.
Sure. So the company that we're going to talk about anonymously today is a large-scale tech company that has a marketplace. And so they have an online and an offline risk. They have a trust and safety team and a customer service team who are also involved in trust and safety issues. So among other things, their trust and safety team deal with difficult cases involving robbery, mugging, assault and sexual assault, animal cruelty, verbal abuse, including hate speech and discrimination, child abuse or neglect, pornography and distressing images.
This is so interesting because as I've worked, so my experience in trust and safety was way back when I worked at Airbnb. But as I've worked with trust and safety teams, as I've started kind of building my own business, my own practice, and through Conterra, I've noticed that there's very similar issues that are dealt with in all of these trust and safety organizations. How they're structured is slightly different, but that concept of online and offline risk and being able to not only manage those risks, but also mitigate, hopefully, those risks. It seems like most tech companies that have a platform, that's something that they have to do because they're online and this risk comes with the territory. So it's interesting. I'd also love to hear in the chat too, if anyone's on a trust and safety team and if this resonates with them. But it seems fairly common for most of the trust and safety organizations, especially for tech platforms.
I think the risk is built into the role, as in so many high pressure, high exposure roles. There's these hidden or becoming progressively less hidden as staff wellbeing and stress and resilience has moved in the last almost 2 decades now more and more into people's focus. I think it's becoming less hidden, but I think each of these roles, the trust and safety roles, and many of the other organizations that Conterra works with in humanitarian aid, they all have their unusual pocket pressures, and trust and safety absolutely exposure to graphic content and a lot of really challenging content and having to have a lot of really challenging conversations is definitely one of those, niche pressures that trust and safety have.
Absolutely. So many people, when I mention trust and safety, if they aren't in a tech platform, they're like, what's that? What does that even mean? Right. So how did Conterra get involved in working with trust and safety teams? Can you give us a little background and how Conterra got involved in this?
Yeah. So Conterra has particular expertise in working in high risk and high stress environments. And everybody in the Conterra Group network, so our counsellors, our trainers, our resilience, our organisational resilience specialists, they all have demonstrated and specialised expertise in their field of practice, and also either in working with or in a lived experience or both, in the sort of role that the clients that we specialise in working with often have. So during the last 15 years of the Conterra Group's existence, that much of that work has been conducted with humanitarian and development organisations and human rights and advocacy organisations around the world. So working with staff working in refugee camps, conflict zones, and other really challenging environments. So humanitarian workers face a lot of physical risk, and they're also exposed to a lot of material that triggers vicarious trauma. So psychological safety when working with graphic content and distressing and challenging case studies and material is a really live issue for them. And in recent years, a number of tech companies with trust and safety teams have sought out Conterra because of that expertise and how it applies to their challenges working with graphic content and distressing material day after day.
Yep, absolutely. We noticed that in early days Airbnb when we first met Conterra and they started talking about trauma-informed approaches, and we were like, oh, that's nice. We should talk about that. How do we look through that lens? And I think that is a really unique lens that Conterra has, that it offers so many solutions to a lot of the challenges that trust and safety teams are struggling with or do struggle with, are presented with. So let's jump into the case study. That's why everybody's here. Thank you all for being here today. If you didn't hear or if you jumped in late, there is a Q&A section. So feel free to add any questions in that Q&A section, and we'll try and keep an eye on that and answer any questions as they come up. But Lisa, let's dig in. I would love to know, what were the main challenges that were presented in this case study, the organization that came to you, and how did you approach these challenges?
So the organisation that we're talking about already had some traditional staff support programs in place. So they had an employee assistance program, but they had come to recognise that a subset of their staff, so that customer service team, the health and safety team, the content moderation team, were all working in roles that expose them to unique and inherently stressful sort of situations and types of content, and unusually high levels of graphic content and distressing information and pressure. So they contacted us because they wanted to explore options for providing additional, more specialized support for those teams, because they were getting feedback that the traditional EAP, while really good in many ways for many people, wasn't providing sort of the level of insight and specialized support for those particular challenges that staff were wanting.
Absolutely. And I don't think this is, just to kind of put this out there, I don't think that this is unique to this one organization, right? I think that this is a challenge that all trust and safety organizations face. And I've learned that over the years as a lot of the trust and safety folks from Airbnb have dispersed now, right? And are at these new different tech platforms. The challenges remain, right? The challenging material and the graphic content, the things that people are seeing, and how to actually support the humans behind the work so that they can show up and do their best work. It's something that's a theme across multiple trust and safety teams. So it's really interesting that this is coming up, and Conterra seems to be fairly well fit to actually address some of these challenges.
I know it's a while ago now, but I have a question for you, Kiki.
Yes, please.
What was it that led you to look outside? Because you would have had traditional support structures in place and well as Airbnb. So thinking back, what was it that pushed you to go, oh, this is a good try, but not it's not good enough, basically.
Not hitting the mark. Yeah. So selfishly, so I founded our trust and safety training team at Airbnb, and we had no limit to the amount of challenging training topics that we were tasked with training the team on. And the more that we were training the teams, the more we realized that people were triggered, frankly, by some of the information that we were trying to share. And so for me, it was, how do I actually couple a really challenging but necessary or vital topic and a learning on that topic? And how do I couple that with through the lens of taking care of the well-being of these employees? How do we set people up for success, especially when they're new employees coming into trust and safety? How do we give them the tools to be able to take care of themselves, to build resilience, and then to be able to show up at work and take on these challenging cases day after day after day, week after week after week, especially during really busy periods of time? So selfishly, that's why I was looking outside, was I'm not a psychologist, right? And so how do I take into consideration the well-being of someone while also trying to train on anti-discrimination or challenging content or so many other topics that trust and safety teams deal with? And I think that was really the biggest benefit from my mind, from my learning and development brain, was being able to help prepare people and give people tools and just acknowledge that this stuff is hard, right? Yeah. And how do you
it's so hard that you were seeing people reacting during the trainings, right? Which just goes to show that if you're seeing those sorts of reactions and picking up on them in training sessions, and the reason that those reactions are there is because the content is so hard in work, and so many people were accumulating experiences which were then being triggered by the training topic.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. That was, I think from a broader standpoint, I think we were starting to see people burn out. We were starting to see attrition. So from the business standpoint, I think that was why we reached out, and we're looking at other options outside of the traditional EAP program and the other we didn't actually have a specific trust and safety wellness program, which we implemented after Conterra came in and supported us, because we realized the importance of being able to support the well-being and the resilience specifically of trust and safety members. It's just slightly different. And they needed something that was slightly different. And so I think from a high level, from a business standpoint, it was really watching people burn out and then having to train a whole new group of people to come on board. It just wasn't efficient. We were losing money by doing that, right? And so how can you retain these amazing employees who have done all of this work in the trust and safety space, and they are super knowledgeable? How do you retain those employees? I think retention was a really big focus for why we went outside of our org.
Yeah.
Okay. Amazing. So I'm going to move us on here. I'd love to know where you started, right? So when this company came to you, when this organization came to you, where did you actually start? How did you customize services to meet the specific needs or challenges that were coming up with this specific organization?
So we really took the time on the front end to understand the current challenges, and we talked with the team managers and the leadership about the different teams that they were most interested in, who are dealing with, interested in, I guess I should clarify, interested in supporting through the lens of these unique pressures. The ones who are dealing with sensitive cases and content and who are experiencing some of those really obvious challenges to wellbeing. So the organisation themselves were clear that they wanted to start with some training sessions, provide specialised counselling through an employee resilience program, check in monthly with us to see how it was going. So build that relationship with us as a partner, and do some pre and post assessment of impact. And so that's where we started. After some initial conversations, which are always so helpful, you get so much information by having the time to sit down and just talk over what's going on. Tell me what you're seeing, what's going on, and digging together into what that might mean. Then we provided them with a list of topics that we thought would address some of the primary challenges, and the organisation themselves indicated which topics and sessions they wanted to start with in the initial pilot program, in the sort of 6-month program we were running in that first year.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, I can't wait to hear. What were some of those solutions that you posed? What were some of the trainings and the solutions that you proposed to implement, and what did they choose as their kind of initial priorities of what they wanted from Conterra?
Sure. So the teams in focus, you can see them on the screen there. They were the customer service teams who take phone calls regarding serious allegations, the health and safety team who investigate serious allegations, and the content moderation teams who moderate user-generated content. So those were the teams that we were talking about in the initial conversations. We were looking to collect some of that pre-post data, which always gives you so much of a good idea of also where to head in the future. There's so many benefits to trying to track some of this as we go along. So we did a pre-series survey and a post-series survey that were matched. We looked at the training content program that they picked, and we designed some questions actually based on those topics to try to capture, is confidence going to increase in relation to these specific topics? Is understanding going to increase? We also administered a feedback form after every workshop. So, the forms were all used to filling out at the end of workshops. And after we had run through the whole 4 training program series, we sat down and we did 2 one-hour focus groups. And again, the value that comes from taking time to do these sorts of conversations is enormous. Yeah. I think so often we're tempted to skip this part of the process, but the richness that you get from actually being in the same virtual room as people and talking this through is huge. So we did a 1 hour focus group with the manager team at the end of the program, and one with staff. So capture their reflections, their learnings, find out what had stuck with them, and find out what they were thinking about looking forward. So the pilot program workshops that the client organisation selected, there were 4 of them. The first one was understanding and coping with vicarious trauma, and that ran for all team members. The second was understanding and coping with vicarious trauma for managers. So building on that first workshop, but working with a smaller subset of managers about understanding what things that managers and leadership can do to mitigate and prevent vicarious trauma. So moving beyond just the self-care stuff and the awareness stuff that works on an individual level, but starting to broaden that lens and look more systemically. Yep. We did and both of those sessions, I think, were about 2.5 hours long. And delivered virtually. We did a 4-hour session on recruiting for resilience, and we did a 5-hour split over 2 days on conducting trauma-informed investigations. So those were the 4 topics that the client selected in the beginning.
I love it. I want to just pause here real quick. So one thing that, as someone who's helped host some of these workshops and also received some of these workshops, I think the difference when you say workshops, I think of like a typical training, right? Like a typical online training. But I think I just want to kind of call out that the focus of these workshops was really to get into those rooms and be super engaging and get people to kind of give what are the challenges? How are you feeling? Where could you get stuck with this information, right? There's so much great information in there, but it's hard when someone's just talking at you, right? So you mentioned these were like 2-hour workshops.
Yeah.
The reason for that is because there's so much information, yes, but also how do you apply this information in your work, right? Talking to the clients. And I think that's where so much learning actually happens, is talking through how do we apply this, and where are you going to get stuck, and where are you challenged with this information? Where does this show up for you, right?
There's always a lot of lived wisdom in the room when you're talking about something like vicarious trauma that everybody has experienced on some level from some angle. And I think calling that lived wisdom out, and another function of these sorts of team workshops is it really normalizes discussing this topic, and it helps people see they're not the only ones who have experienced impact, and the ebb and flow of that impact, it's also really helpful. People just love to hear how their teammates not only think about it and what their experiences have been, but how they're things that they're choosing to do to counteract the impact and to take the impact on and to make meaning from these experiences, because we're such meaning-making machines, and that meaning-making is so integral with how we understand and cope with vicarious trauma, recognizing that it's impossible to work with graphic content on a regular basis without being impacted. Like that, it's like trying to walk through a rainstorm and not get wet. Like that is the impossible part. And so recognizing that there is going to be impact and that there's going to be, positive and negative can be loaded words, but there's going to be positive and negative impacts of that challenge process to us, I think is so important, and really helps people in teams to see that when to see that their teammates are experiencing not the same thing they're experiencing, but the same process, like a similar process.
Yep, absolutely. And so helpful for the managers also, right? Like, I think that that's the big feedback that I've heard in the past is this information is great, but I want my manager to know about this. I want my manager to be aware. I want my manager to bring in this knowledge and this awareness and the language, right? And I've seen a lot of great things come from those management discussions, because then they're looking through that lens and it's like, how do we better support our teams, right? And how can we proactively mitigate burnout or vicarious trauma on our teams? It becomes more of a cultural focus versus just a learning opportunity. Thanks for
and culture change is so hard. It takes a long time to turn that ship, right? And it's an ongoing process as well. And so when we're thinking about these topics and this sort of impact, you do also, it's so helpful to play the long game and to think, not like this is not something that we're going to dig up and fix in one sort of series of 2 workshops on VT. That's not how it works. But how can we start to how can we create that language, that shared language, and how can we create several touch points from the organization coming at this from different angles, so that we are starting to think about creating a culture that has space for acknowledgement of these sorts of dynamics and what we do with them.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for letting me go off script there. I had things to say. Amazing. Keep it coming. Tell us a little bit more about some of the how this kind of went, how this pilot program went. And I know we're going to touch on vicarious trauma as well, but I want to make sure that you have time to kind of wrap up that initial question around the solutions and services that Conterra provided.
Well, I can whiz through. I think it helps with the sort of solutions and services. I'll just do a quick whistle-stop tour of vicarious trauma, because some people here, may not have a clear understanding of what we're talking about with VT. So I'll just quickly slide through that, and then we'll talk about the outcomes. So just to be clear on what vicarious trauma is, it's a process that can arise when you witness or hear about other people's suffering or need, and you feel a commitment or a sense of responsibility to help. And you can see how people working in customer service with really challenging cases coming at them regularly are vulnerable to being impacted by this process. And it's a cumulative and ongoing process that unfolds over time. So to understand a little bit about how this works and what it does, let's just quickly look at the impact of working with that graphic content we were referencing. So you can think of graphic content as any material depicting human or animal suffering or threat that causes emotional responses like the ones you see on your screen: the shock, the shame or guilt, the anger or rage, horror or revulsion, sadness or grief, and fear or anxiety. And these are normal, understandable, logical reactions to some of the material that people in trust and safety are exposed to. And same with humanitarian workers. But the impact of that exposure over time, it tends to change and challenge us on multiple levels. But here are just 2. It can change our own sense of felt safety in the world, and it can change and challenge our deeper sense of meaning, purpose, and hope. And it tends to show up, vicarious trauma, over time in 3 different areas. So you can see it in the general signs of stress. We can all uptick in that area of stress that we know well, what the general signs are. Trouble sleeping is an obvious one. It can tend to show up in more specialized, narrower sets of trauma reactions. So you don't actually have to experience a potentially traumatic event yourself to be impacted. Witnessing or hearing about it can trigger very similar reactions, and it tends to show up in changes in relationship. So you asked about results and what did we see as we went through this pilot program? And on average, participants reported feeling more confident that they had the tools and strategies that they could use to help them manage stress. So that was really clear in the data. And there was a lot more data than I'm presenting here. I won't bore you with the whole 15-page report, but I just pulled out a couple of things that seemed really relevant to the topics that we're discussing, top of content. So one of the other interesting things that we saw was participants' confidence increased markedly, that they could explain what vicarious trauma was if they were asked, that they understand what can cause vicarious trauma, and that they understand what they can do themselves to help prevent or reduce vicarious trauma. Because like we were talking about, this is an inevitable process, this challenge and change that comes with this. And so everybody working in these sorts of fields, it's really helpful for them to have a baseline understanding of that, and to say, yeah, and it's not all negative either. That I didn't go into that in what I was, but it's not all negative. That deep sense of change to challenge and purpose breeds enhanced perspective. It can breed gratitude. It can breed all sorts of other things that people really value. And that's also really important to talk about, I think.
I think what you're saying too is that as people have gained the insight into what some of these things are, right? Like I didn't know what vicarious trauma was before we brought Kantera at Airbnb. And I remember being in the room with a lot of my peers, and we went through the leadership training. And I think there might have even been tears involved from multiple people on the team, because it was this, oh my gosh, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
And you feel this too? Oh my gosh, it's not just me. Like, I'm not just a highly sensitive human that is feeling all these, look, we're all in the same boat, right? It was like the team cohesion improved, the confidence level improved, the awareness improved. And then we had something to do about it, versus, at least for me, my typical way of dealing with this was stop being so sensitive, Kiki. And that just really helped me.
It's impossible. Like, if you're wired to be sensitive, you're going to be sensitive, and trying to shut that down. And well, we're not having a workshop here, so I'll resist the temptation to like dive into that. But if I heard you say something like that in a workshop, there's so much in that, right? That sensitivity is a gift, and it's part of who you are. And the risks, it makes you more vulnerable to impact in some ways, but trying to shut that down also carries all sorts of other unwanted risks too. And so the interesting thing is learning to acknowledge that we are wired the way we are wired.
Yep.
And how do we learn to work with that wiring in ways that enable us to do the sort of work that we want to do in a sustainable way?
Yep, absolutely. Sorry for interrupting. I just had to
No,
mention.
it's all right. I'm going to drag myself back off my vicarious trauma soapbox now and talk about data highlights. So what else did we see?
Yes.
We saw an increase in staff confidence and belief that the organisation was committed to supporting a culture of staff support, and would continue to take action to create an increasingly robust culture of staff support, which was beautiful to see in the data. A couple of other things that I noticed were participants appreciated being able to get a sense of Kantera via the workshops. And this was great to see articulated. People proactively said, yeah, you're providing that specialized counseling for us as well, and we're more likely to reach out for support if needed, because we have a sense of who the face is behind the counseling. Like we've been able to get a sense of how you operate because we've had these sessions, and that was good to see. Yeah. And you can see that it's important to have access to trauma-informed counseling rather than a generalist. So there's that awareness from the participant level that they were appreciating the specialized support, the ability of it. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say on that last slide, what that screams to me is increased engagement, right? Like if you know that you're whatever role you have and whatever company you're working in, if you know that they care about you, they care about your well-being, they care about, how they support you, you're going to be more committed to the work that you're doing within that organization. So I think from like an organizational perspective, you're increasing that engagement, really, is what that says to me, which is pretty cool.
And that psychological safety marker, which is sometimes very hard to move the needle on.
Yes.
So a couple more comments just on the last data slide. So it felt great knowing our colleagues were going through similar experiences. If it helps you know you're not alone. And we see this time and time again, that the valuing of that sense of shared experience.
Yeah.
Diving into the root causes, people said, it helped me to see a wide range of causes I wasn't aware of before the training. And realizing that there's so much more to assessing resilience than assessing how someone handles stress. So at the end, we asked them, what do you want to learn more about? Because this organization already had a clear vision for playing the long game, which was so wonderful and is so admirable. But recognizing that this is a medium to long-term investment. Participants across the data, via the feedback forms, via the focus groups, we had several different channels that we were collecting feedback, and there was a lot of feedback, but these were three of the things that bubbled to the surface. They wanted more information about basic stress management and stress management skills. And this one surprised me a little, because I had thought maybe that this team wouldn't, but they said actually coming in through the front door of vicarious trauma made me go, wait a second, there's some big gaps missing in my general stress management toolbox. And I'd really love to dig more into the dynamics of that and what we can do about that in general, and specifically practices. This team was very interested in practicing some of those skills in session, which is great because you remember things and use them when you practice them 10 times more. Navigating challenging conversations in an emotionally respectful way, and self-care related to challenging conversations, and burnout. So these were three of the topics that bubbled to the surface where they said, we would like more of that.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Kiki.
I was just going to say, it's interesting. I feel like all teams, having collaborated with Conterra, both inside of an organization and then now, where people start isn't always the same. And I'm realizing this right now. This is an epiphany I'm sharing in this moment. Everyone kind of starts with their unique set of challenges. And although the challenges are very similar across multiple trust and safety organizations, what that particular organization is struggling with at this time, or whenever they contact Conterra, right, is different sometimes. But one thing that I have experienced both at Airbnb and then also in working with some of these companies through Conterra is that no matter where they start, once they start kind of exploring some of this information and they see some of the benefits and they experience some of those benefits, so many of the benefits that even just come from the awareness or the knowledge of what vicarious trauma actually is, right? Like, I think continuing the services is always kind of a thing, right? And so I'll never forget one of the sessions that we did back at Airbnb. By the end of the workshop, we were like, we want to learn, we want to do this, we want to do this, we want to do this, we want to do this. We had all these like additional things that kind of opened up Pandora's box, and we were able to kind of create a network of all of these different workshops and support and services that helped us create really a culture of resilience and well-being. So how does that impact, like when you're looking at this specific case study, was that the same concept? Did they move forward with additional support? And what did that look like?
They did move forward with additional support, which was wonderful. And, I think I mentioned that there was a clear sense that they were playing a long game right from the beginning, which is something that always thrills me when I see it, because like you said, sometimes organizations will come in and go hoping that just one or two workshops will fix the challenge. But what it often does is unlock that Pandora's box, which is what you want, right? Because what you want is actually culture change, and culture change is never going to happen off the back of one single workshop.
No.
You might get culture tweaks off the back of one workshop, like it has impact, but it's not going to, if you really are interested in creating a culture of staff support and well-being, and that, you know, that's a multi-pronged effort. And
Yes.
and
it's that concept too of like the retention, right?
Yeah.
One workshop isn't going to necessarily impact your retention or your attrition, right? But it's this network of support, ongoing support, that really can have that culture change or that culture shift or transformation in some cases, that then leads to a lot of these benefits, right? That higher engagement, and you get little bits of it. And I think a lot of companies see that and they're like, ooh, our people are more engaged. Our people feel, you know, are able to handle their own emotions and know what to do with that. They have support that they can go get. So they start to see some of the benefits. And I think for a lot of companies, it's like, let's turn that dial up. You know, even the companies that maybe don't present wanting the long game, right? Like I've seen that as well.
Yeah, and a lot of companies will come into this step by step, which is also great. And, you know, they'll have an initial workshop on vicarious trauma, which does actually, you know, I don't want to downplay the impact that can have either, because a culture tweak is no small thing. To bring that phrase vicarious trauma into the workplace and into a team, that can actually have a very big shift. But the sort of shift you also want to anticipate is that having had that paradigm shift around vicarious trauma and understanding what it is and acknowledging its existence and the impact of the inevitability of that process that comes with this sort of work, that does open up curiosity and scope for more. And that scope for more doesn't have to come through necessarily additional specialized training, or, you know, there's lots of directions you can take that in. But I think when I talk about playing the long game, I want organizations to think about, how do we build on any training investment we're going to make? So if we're starting with a single workshop on vicarious trauma, we don't have to necessarily think about committing to a whole program next year or 5 more specialized workshops, but how are we going to open up space for discussion of those issues within the team? How are we going to create other touch points? How are managers going to actually build this new awareness into their conversations with their staff? How are staff going to build it in with each other? So, you know, there's lots of different ways you can play a long game, and lots of tools you can draw upon to help make that happen. But this organization was interested in doing that work internally, and also with some external support with additional training from Conterra. And what they chose to do in year 2 was, we went through a similar process off the back of the pilot program, where we sat down, we said, okay, what stuck with you? What really helped? Here's all the data about what we're seeing for what staff want. What's top of mind at the moment in terms of challenges, and how can we design next year's program to meet that? And they designed the entire year in advance, which, again, I was like, this is great process, because it lets us map out a training sequence in advance where we sprinkle stuff through the year. And so really I have a lot of respect for how this particular team and organization is approaching this. But here is what they picked to do in year 2. They continued with the specialized counseling coverage. They picked up on that we want more stress management, and they chose to work with a new tool that Conterra has developed called the Conterra Inventory for Resilience Builders. And so we have given 3 different teams the opportunity to take that tool and receive their individualized personal feedback report, and then participate in a half-day workshop building off the back of that. So they've got their report with their own factor scores, and then they come to that workshop and get to work with that on an individual and a team level.
Yep, amazing.
We have planned for a 4-part training series on preventing and addressing burnout for the management group. There is a training on supporting peers that's happening, because that was another thing that got picked up in the data about supporting peers who are having challenges. They brought in another team that we didn't work with in the first year, and so we reran the understanding and coping with vicarious trauma. And anybody from the first year that wanted a refresher or had joined the team since then folded into that session.
Amazing.
We have planned for a training on key skills for coping with challenging calls as well, so that picking up on that, these calls are really hard. What are some skills, and how can we manage ourselves and our reactions after these calls. And they're doing something that I really love. They're planning for team discussions. They're having what they're calling wellbeing moments. So we're helping them with a curriculum for wellbeing moments where they'll give a resource, to one sheet resource to the team at the beginning of the month that has a one article or a 10-minute TED talk or something video on it. So it requires like a 10-minute investment before, say, a 45-moment meeting at some point during the month where they come together to talk about this one aspect, and we get to really narrow the lens down and talk about let's talk about rest. What does rest mean to you? How do you think about it in your life? How does our culture think about rest? How do we experience and build rest into our workday? How do we think about this outside work? Like you could talk about these topics for hours, right? So this gives giving the teams a chance to really narrow the lens and touch base with each other on these specialized teams. So you can see that they're doing a lot in year 2. And I wouldn't want to say you have to, for organizations that want to play the long game, it doesn't have to look like that. You know, you can start out with 4 topics and say, let's build this one per quarter, and here's how we're going to wrap around, and here's how we're going to carry it into the culture. So
I think that, that customization, I think that's such a unique add, right? Like that's such a unique value add, is being able to, it's not just, oh, you want support, here's all of our off the shelf stuff, pick which one you want, right? It's very much, even when you're working with the same company, the same organization, you come back to the drawing board and it's like, okay, what did we learn? What was super helpful? What do we now need? What's the next step? And it's customizing the existing content maybe, and building new content. These well-being moments and curriculum around that. Oh my gosh.
It's so fun, that one. I love it so much, what they're doing with this. It's really
so cool.
Really cool. And we're having a lot of fun working with them on that.
That's awesome. It's amazing. And I think it's so interesting thinking back to my experience at Airbnb. I think all of these are valuable, you know, individually, but continuing this cadence of support, continuing the cadence of learning around well-being, around self-care, around resilience, that's actually what I think really helps with that culture shift, that culture change, right? Is yes, these one workshops are super helpful. You might even see a huge kind of shift initially, but speaking from experience, it's really easy to then you have your next busy season, whatever that is, whenever your busy season is, and you have forgotten how to take care of yourself because you've been so busy, and it can kind of fall into, you know, onto the back burner. It's like going on an offsite and having this amazing, all these innovative ideas for how we're going to move forward the next year. And then no one does anything about it. And all the notes just kind of die a slow death on a Google Doc somewhere. And I love the fact that this organization was able to go, okay, here's the stake in the ground. What have we learned? And working with Conterra, being able to then say, okay, what's the next step? And what does that look like? And like you said, I think it's been different starting points, different follow-ups, different cadences, different types of support, right? Or services. It's not all workshops. And that's where it gets really fun talking to some of these organizations. And as you're kind of bouncing around ideas, you get kind of the trauma-informed knowledge and care, but then you also have the corporate company or the organization. They're the experts on what they need ultimately. And bringing those two things together, I think just really sparks magic and cultivates that shift in culture. I definitely saw that at Airbnb.
Yeah. And I mean, that you picked up on some of the benefits of partnering with an organization like Conterra, you know, with that medium to long-term game in mind. Then your partner gets ongoing insights regarding your organization's unique culture and the challenges, the needs, and you build the relationships with the focal points that allow you to have those conversations about, okay, so let's look at the span of the year. What were the highlights? What didn't land so well? What have we drawn from the collective data that will inform where you want to go next year? And that rapport and that trust is huge, I think.
Absolutely. And I've seen the innovation also. I mean, just with working, you and I had the joy of partnering on a different case study with a different organization. And there were moments where we had a plan. We were like, yep, this is what we're doing. The organization was like, yep, that's what we want you to do. And then we would have some insight, and we had the trust to be able to go back to the team and say, you know what, we have an innovative idea for a shift of how we might do this, right? And this is why, and this is what we think the benefit will be. And it's due to this feedback. So you get this like innovative kind of idea generation that then happens as you start to get to know the organization and what they need. And you can get that feedback and kind of spin something up or shift, knowing what the North Star is and where they're headed.
Did you see that with Airbnb when you partner with Conterra over time? I mean, how did you see that yield value, that playing that long game? And I also don't want to discount the short game. Like there is value in saying, look, we can't we can't think past 2 weeks from now. So we can't think about a long game right now, but we have a big problem right now. Like, that's great. Start there. But so I don't want to discount that either. But and maybe that's where you came in with Airbnb. You know,
that's exactly
with a pain point, and then things evolve from there. But what benefits did you see partnering over time with Airbnb?
So I can't really say if I had not gotten personally, and I'm just speaking for myself here, but I saw it in other people as well. I heard it from my team. Had I not gotten some of the knowledge and the learning that Conterra initially provided in some of those initial workshops, I don't know that I would have lasted as long at Airbnb. I ended up being there for 9 years. I burned out 3 different times. And the first time I burned out was before I ever met Conterra, and I had no idea what was happening. The second time was like right before we had those workshops, and it was like, oh my God, it's not just me. You guys all feel this too? Okay, great. And then all of a sudden we gained this additional knowledge. We started to shift how we built programs, how we built processes. It showed up in some like bizarre ways down the line, where instead of building a process and only looking at, okay, what contact do we have to give to the host or the guest, right? And how are we going to mitigate this particular risk? It also came with, how do we couple this process with space to be able, so for instance, I'll just use like an example. We had folks on the phones for trust and safety. They had 3 minutes at the end of a phone call, no matter what that phone call was about. They had 3 minutes at the end of the phone call to wrap up their notes and be back online for the next phone call. And during busy times, that next phone call came right away. And we started to look at our processes and go, whoa, like we're not giving folks a chance. If they just got off a phone call with something that was extremely triggering or heavy or challenging in some way, which many of these calls were, we need to give them time and space to diffuse and kind of de-escalate their own experience, even just be aware of their own experience, right? And so I feel like some of the initial benefits that we saw were actually the interpersonal relationships within the team, because if I got off a phone call and just was completely triggered and then had to go on to the next phone call and on to the next phone call and on to the next phone call, and now I get to be off for a little while because I'm joining a team meeting, you know who's going to be kind of bitchy in that team meeting? This girl, because I didn't have a chance to kind of come to and go, oh my God, that was a lot, right? And just the awareness and the presence of being able to do that. And so there were so many benefits that I think were cultivated just from those initial workshops. But to answer your question, the more long-term benefits, we created so many different programs. We completely revamped the way that we did training. We realized the importance of coupling those challenging topics with an eye towards well-being and resilience and how to care for yourself in collaboration with dealing with these types of things, which I think also sparked some intrinsic motivation maybe for employees. I know it did for me. It wasn't just looking at the difficult work in front of me and going, oh God, why did I pick this, right? Because most trust and safety folks, at least that I've met, are trust and safetyers for life. There's a passion there. There's a fire there that even if you burn out multiple times, speaking from experience, you still have a passion for trust and safety and the work that we do in this space. And so it's essential to be able to figure out, how do I actually support myself and how do I support the people around me? And so I think that was really one of the big benefits, was that a lot of our team, we retained a lot of our team, and we were able to build on what we had learned versus allowing everything to just kind of build up and then quit, and I can't say that I wouldn't have done that had we not brought Conterra in when I was at Airbnb. I know a lot of other people that would have definitely were at that tipping point, and I think even just being able to come back to the content, like I said, you have a busy season, whatever that is for you, whether it's the summer months or the winter months. And it's really easy to put your own wellness on the back burner, your own kind of feelings and emotions and whatever else might be coming up. We do this in everyday life, whether or not we're working on trust and safety. I know I skip breaks sometimes. And then later I'm like, oh God, why am I so irritable? Oh, I skipped my breaks today. So it happens to all of us, but I think especially in the trust and safety space, it's so important to kind of have these continual mechanisms for support, and mechanisms to discuss, right, and process what's actually happening. I think there's so much change in these companies, right? A lot of these tech companies are moving very quickly. There's a high level of change. There's a high level of growth. It's usually a complex environment with global teams. And having this kind of brings everybody back together and hits the pause button for a minute. And it's like, oh, okay, exhale. Where are we at? What do we need? What type of support do we need? And how do we best move forward? And I think that's where the best decisions are then made, rather than just being in that hamster wheel and making decisions in that fast-paced environment, while you're heightened emotionally or with your stress, you just make better decisions. And so we were more mindful of where we were going and why, and what we needed to do to get there.
Yeah.
That was a really long-winded answer, but I had a lot to say.
No, it's a great answer. I mean, it's almost like we're getting 2 case studies for the price of one. It's really good.
I love it. I want to. Oh, go ahead.
Were you going to open it up for questions? Because I was going to do the same thing.
Yes.
The time going. I'm aware we've been chatting away and loving it, but let's. If anybody has any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat now, and Lauren is going to help us out and filter those along, because one thing I cannot do is talk and pay attention to the chat at the same time. I'm hopeless at it. So Kiki, if you spotted any questions, or Lauren.
Lauren, actually, there were a couple questions that came up and she was able to answer them, I think, in the chat. Just so everyone knows, we will be sending out a follow-up email with some, not only the slides, but some helpful resources. And so that will be coming out as well as the recording. I think you also get a copy of the recording. Thank you, Lauren, for remembering to record this. And but I do know that there were some additional questions that had been kind of asked previously from some folks.
See this. Great. Okay. So I see a question here. Were senior leaders on board with the focus of this, and any advice on how to make the case to leaders about the importance of this, especially the long game? That is such a good question, and we could talk about that for an hour. Where to start with this? So in this case, yes, the senior leaders, decision makers were on board with this, and that was that's a luxury, frankly, because that's not always the way it was. So the senior leaders, decision makers for this case were the team leaders for the teams that we were working directly with, and they had the discretion over budget and over decision-making authority, or if I'm mistaken in that, then they were advocating very successfully behind the scenes for what was going on. But any advice about how to make the case to leaders about the importance of this, especially the long game? I think, gosh, this really is such a great topic. I have 1 or 2 thoughts, and then Kiki, I'll kick the ball to you to see what you think as well. Mm-hmm. Ideally, it's wonderful to have a channel that allows the senior leaders to hear from people about their experience with these topics. And so one way in is to start with just that single workshop. But make sure that you are running a feedback form afterwards, that the workshop is interactive, that you are capturing comments and things both during the workshop and also in the feedback form, so that you have quotes which can be completely anonymous from participant point of view, and feedback forms will be anonymous, but you actually have something that you can take to leaders and say, look at this feedback data from this workshop, look at these quotes about what people valued from this session, what they want more. And that's a one way in to open up the discussion. It's great if you can actually get senior leaders to have an experience themselves. So if you put them through a 1 hour workshop on vicarious trauma, very, very often they'll have that same process that Kiki and I were talking about, where there's that realization of like, oh, this is not just about other people. This is about me. I've also experienced this process. Yeah. It's hard, I know, to get senior leaders to set aside time for that sort of training or to participate in that process. But you might want to come at it not as a workshop. You might want to have it as a focus group type discussion with educational content built in. Those are a couple of initial thoughts I have. Kiki, what do you have? What's your thoughts about how do you make this case to senior leaders? Because it's a really great question, because if there's not leadership buy-in, then it's really an uphill battle in terms that culture change piece is so much harder.
Yep. So we had something at Airbnb, and I also want to say I feel like this is a luxury. I haven't heard about this happening in a lot of organizations, but it was so incredibly impactful. We had all the way up to the founders. We had specific days each. I don't remember if it was monthly or if it was quarterly. I think we started quarterly, and then I think they started doing it monthly, where they would just trade off, right? But where we would have these leaders come in and almost like do the work of a trust and safety agent. So they didn't actually do the work because we didn't want them to break anything, because it wasn't their typical job, right? They weren't trained to do this work, but they would shadow. And so we would have these shadowing sessions where senior level leaders all the way up to the founder level would be shadowing like our experts, right? And we would do like a recording and send that recording. But there was this shadowing kind of process that senior leaders had to do. And it was twofold. One, it was to show support. And it was the goal of kind of increasing engagement, right? And increasing that understanding that like, I'm here to support you. What would make this job easier for you, right? So they had like a list of questions of like, what's the most challenging aspect of your job? What would make it easier for you? What would make your job more fun? What would make it more effective, right? And so they had this kind of list of questions. And so they came across versus like a manager that's standing over your shoulder watching your every move, because that was the issue that we had to get over. It became so easy to get senior leadership on board with anything that we needed. In fact, they were oftentimes the advocates for, we need to bring in additional, support in some of these areas. So just getting that in front of them.
That's such a powerful process. And gosh, yeah, when you can get leadership in touch with what's happening for the staff on the front lines, it makes such a difference. I had a couple of additional thoughts while you were talking, Kiki. One is to look at the organization's values. So very often there's really good discussion points by saying, hey, these are our stated values. Mm-hmm. And here's ways we're living these values out really well. And here's maybe ways where, we are directing a lot of energy out, but we're not directing a lot of that care energy inwards. And what are ways we can live these values more internally as a team? And a much less positive way of approaching it is also to make it quite clear to leadership the potential costs of not supporting staff. So there's more and more liability risks at stake, and for content moderation and things like that. And there's a number of recent legal decisions. I'm not going to quote them because I'll get the dates and things wrong, but there's very prominent tech companies, Facebook included, I know that one, that have recently had to settle or been held liable for psychological injury in content moderation teams. And so making those risks clear as well, of like, hey, this is a duty of care issue, and here are different ways that plays out. And one of those is that liability risk angle.
Yep.
So I want to pick up on this second question I see here. that it was mentioned that there were initial conversations, a survey, a focus group. Was this like an assessment? If not, is that something available to help us figure out the best approaches to training topics for our team? Absolutely. So this was almost like an informal assessment, I would say. It was a fairly small team at the time that we started working. It's grown a lot now, but we were working with less than 20 in the team. And so that focus group and the focus group helped us formalize the first year plan. And that wasn't a formal assessment, but something that Conterra does and something that is highly recommended is to start with an assessment, a more formal assessment. And that involves administering a survey usually. And what's in that survey depends on what they're most interested in finding out. But all of these data methodologies are looking at drawing out that information of what are the current pain points and where do you want to head with them. So looking for those strategic points of influence to start with. So surveys, focus groups, one-on-one interviews often yield enormous amounts of information. And so a detailed big scope assessment would involve all three. It would involve the survey, several focus groups involving people at different levels, so that there's that freedom for staff to speak, because that's sometimes quite difficult if you have a group with management or leadership and staff at the same time. Mm-hmm. And then select a sample of individual interviews and then synthesizing that data to say, hey, this is what we're spotting. Mm-hmm. This is what we're spotting about your pressure points, and here is what we've gleaned, and also our recommendations on some of those strategic points of influence for where you could start.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one more question here, and I would also love to learn more, because this is a new service that Conterra has started providing. It's the CURB that you mentioned. So Conterra Resilience Builders Inventory, maybe, or something along those lines. Can you give us a little bit more information around CURB and what that is?
Sure. The Conterra Inventory for Resilience Builders is something we're really excited about. We have designed it. We looked at a lot of the resilience inventories that were available in the market, and many of them are wonderful in what they're trying to do, but they were looking at resilience through quite a limited lens. So some of the best known resilience inventories, for example, just look at it in terms of the cognitive aspect of what we're thinking and perspective, and that's super important. But it wasn't as much looking at it from the practical, pragmatic angle of what are the things that we do in our daily lives? What are the different building blocks of resilience? How can we help people to think about how that's at play in their life and how they might want to build on those? So we've worked together within Conterra. Development teams spent almost 2 years working through what are those building blocks of resilience that we think are really important for these high stress, high pressure roles. And we've come up with 10. And there's more about the Conterra Inventory for Resilience Builders on the website. So we can put a link straight to that page in the show notes. Yeah. We'll send that out with email, and you can find out more about it. But there's 10 different factors that we look at. People take the 90 question inventory online and they get their factor scores and their personal report with some sort of, hey, here's where you're clearly really strong and here are your growth edge areas. And then there's an enormous amount of information in that's we can work with in workshops and individually with consultations with people.
Amazing. Man, I wish that was available back in the early days of Airbnb. That sounds so amazing. So I know we were at the end of time. I think we have one more slide just showing folks how to get in touch with us if they're interested. As mentioned, we will be reaching out with a follow-up email, which will have the recording, more information on CURB, as well as some additional information on how to get in touch with Conterra if you or your team are interested in talking a little bit more about how to build resilience and well-being. But thank you all for coming. And Lisa, oh my gosh, you continue to just blow my mind. Thank you so much for bringing your knowledge and expertise and talking through this case study with us today. I could talk to you for hours on this topic, as you know, so we'll let folks jet, but definitely reach out anytime if you have any questions. We're both here. You can also find us on LinkedIn, and we're always happy to help and support and have some conversations. I know there were a couple questions about like how to spot burnout. We love talking about that. So please let us know, and we'd be happy to have a chat. And thank you so much for being
here. Thank you. It was so much fun having this conversation with you. And thank you everybody who made time to be here today or who's watching the recording. We know time is precious, and we appreciate that you're taking the time to think these things through.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.